It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of day that feels like it's already over before it's begun. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and scrolling through my phone, when I heard the familiar rumble of the mail truck outside. I didn't think much of it. Mail comes at the same time every day, right? Except this time, it didn't. The mail usually arrives around 1:30 p.m., but it was barely 9 a.m. I glanced out the window and saw the truck idling at the curb, the engine sputtering like it was on its last legs. The mailman, a guy I'd never seen before, was already halfway up my driveway, holding a small package. He was tall, with a lanky frame and a uniform that looked just a little too big for him. His face was obscured by the brim of his hat, but I could see his lips moving, like he was muttering something to himself. I opened the door before he could knock, and he froze mid-step, as if he hadn't expected me to be home. For a second, we just stared at each other. Then he held out the package and said, "This is for you," the way he said it, like it wasn't a question, like he knew, made my skin crawl. I took the package and our fingers brushed for a split second. His hand was ice cold, even though it was a warm morning. "Thanks," I said. But he was already walking away, his head down, his shoulders hunched. I watched him get back into the truck and drive off, the engine coughing like it might die at any moment. The package was small, about the size of a shoebox, and wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no return address, just my name and address handwritten in neat, blocky letters. I didn't remember ordering anything, but these days it's hard to keep track of online purchases. I figured it was probably something I'd forgotten about. I set the package on the kitchen table and went back to my coffee, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The mailman's face kept popping into my head, or rather the lack of it. I couldn't remember what he looked like, just the sound of his voice and the chill of his hand. After a few minutes, I gave in and opened the package. Inside was a stack of photographs, maybe 24 of them, all taken from inside my house. Some were of the living room, others of the kitchen, and a few were of my bedroom. In one of them, I was asleep in bed, the covers pulled up to my chin. My stomach dropped. I flipped through the photos again, my hands shaking, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The angles were all wrong. They looked like they'd been taken from high up, near the ceiling. But there was no way someone could have gotten into my house without me noticing. I work from home, and I'm here almost all the time. I called the police, but they didn't seem too concerned. "Do you have any security cameras?" the officer asked. "No," I admitted. "Well, there's not much we can do without evidence," he said, "but we'll keep an eye out." I hung up feeling even more uneasy. I spent the rest of the day checking the locks on the doors and windows, but everything seemed secure. By the time night fell, I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump, and I kept imagining the mailman standing outside my window, watching me. The next morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table again, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread when I heard the mail truck outside. My heart skipped a beat. It was 9 a.m. again. I looked out the window, and there he was, the same mailman, walking up my driveway with another package in his hands. This time, I didn't open the door. I just watched him through the window, my breath caught in my throat. He stopped at the doorstep, set the package down, and looked up at the house. For a moment, our eyes met. And then he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. I didn't go outside until he was gone. The package was the same as the first one. Plain brown paper, no return address, my name handwritten on the front. I didn't open it. I couldn't. I haven't seen the mailman since then, but every morning at 9 a.m., I hear the rumble of the mail truck outside. And every morning, there's a new package on my doorstep. I don't know what's inside them. I don't think I want to know. I take the same bus to work every day. It's a habit, a routine, something I don't even think about anymore. The bus comes at 7:15 a.m., sharp, and I'm always at the stop by 7:10. It's the kind of thing you could set your watch to, or at least it used to be. It started on a Thursday. I was running late, slept through my alarm, spilled coffee on my shirt, the usual chaos. And I barely made it to the bus stop by 7:14. I was standing there, catching my breath, when I noticed something strange. There was another bus stop about 50 feet down the road. I'd never seen it before. It wasn't much, just a metal pole with a sign and a bench, but it looked old, like it had been there for years. The paint on the sign was faded, but I could just make out the words, Route 17. That was weird, because Route 17 doesn't exist. At least, not in this city. I've lived here for 5 years, and I've never heard of a Route 17. I didn't have time to think about it, though, because my bus pulled up right on schedule. I got on, found my usual seat, and tried to put the strange bus stop out of my mind. But the next morning, it was still there. This time, I had a few minutes to spare, so I walked over to take a closer look. The bench was rusted, and the sign was covered in graffiti, but the words Route 17 were still visible. I pulled out my phone and checked the transit app, but there was no mention of a Route 17. I was about to take a photo of the sign when I heard the rumble of an engine behind me. I turned around, and there it was. A bus, old and battered, with Route 17 displayed on the front. The doors opened with a hiss, and the driver leaned out. He was an older man with a weathered face and a cap pulled low over his eyes. "You getting on?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, I'm waiting for the 7:15. He stared at me for a moment, then shrugged. "Suit yourself." The doors closed, and the bus pulled away, leaving me standing there with a knot of unease in my stomach. The rest of the week went by without incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about the bus stop. Every morning I'd glance at it as I waited for my bus, and every morning it was still there. Then, on Monday, something changed. I was standing at my usual stop, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the rumble of an engine. I looked up, expecting to see my bus, but it was the Route 17 bus again. This time, it didn't stop. It just slowed down as it passed, and I could see the driver staring at me through the window. His expression was blank, almost like he was looking right through me. The bus kept going, but something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. I checked the time, 7:14. My bus should have been here by now. I waited another 5 minutes, then 10, but my bus never came. I ended up calling a rideshare and getting to work late, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I decided to test something. I got to the bus stop early and stood at the Route 17 stop instead of my usual one. I don't know why. Maybe I was curious, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that it wasn't real. At exactly 7:14, the Route 17 bus pulled up. The doors opened, and the driver looked at me. "You getting on?" I hesitated. "Where does this bus go?" He didn't answer. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. I took a step back. "No thanks." The doors closed, and the bus drove off, leaving me standing there with a growing sense of dread. I haven't seen the Route 17 bus since then, but the stop is still there. Every morning I glance at it as I wait for my bus, and every morning I wonder what would have happened if I had gotten on. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the rumble of an engine outside my apartment, but when I look out the window, there's nothing there. I've lived in this neighborhood for 3 years, and for the most part, it's been quiet. The kind of place where people nod hello but don't really talk. My next-door neighbor, though, he's different. I first noticed him about 6 months ago. He's an older guy, maybe in his late 50s, with thinning gray hair and a habit of wearing the same faded blue windbreaker, no matter the weather. At first, I thought he was just friendly. He'd wave whenever I left for work or came home, and sometimes he'd make small talk about the weather or the garbage schedule. But then I started noticing the timing. It was always the same, 7:15 a.m. when I left for work, and 6 p.m. when I got home. He'd be outside, watering his plants or checking his mail, and he'd always wave or say something like, "Long day at work?" or "You're home late today." At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just a morning person, or maybe he had a routine of his own that happened to line up with mine. But then I started paying closer attention, and that's when things got weird. One morning, I overslept and left the house at 7:30 instead of 7:15. As I was locking the door, I heard his voice behind me. "Running late today?" I turned around, and there he was, standing in his driveway with a watering can in his hand. He was smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Forgot to set my alarm." He nodded, like he already knew. Happens to the best of us. I got in my car and drove off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. How did he know I was running late? The next day, I left at 7:10 just to see what would happen. Sure enough, he was outside, waving as I pulled out of the driveway. "Early start today?" he called out. I didn't answer. I just waved back and drove off, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. Over the next few weeks, I started testing him. I'd leave at different times, take different routes, even park my car a few blocks away and walk home. But no matter what I did, he was always there, always watching, always saying something that made my skin crawl. "You've been working late this week," he said one evening as I was getting out of my car. "How do you know that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged. "Just noticed your car hasn't been in the driveway until after 7. I didn't say anything, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. How long had he been paying that much attention? Then, last week, something happened that made me realize just how deep this went. I was getting ready for bed when I heard a knock at the door. It was almost 10 p.m. and I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole, and there he was, standing on my porch with a small package in his hands. I opened the door just enough to see his face. "Can I help you?" He held out the package. "This was delivered to my house by mistake. It's for you." I took the package, my hands trembling slightly. There was no return address, my name and address handwritten in neat, blocky letters. "Thanks," I said, but he didn't leave. He just stood there staring at me with that same empty smile. "You should be more careful," he said finally. "You never know who's watching." I closed the door and locked it, my heart racing. The package was small, about the size of a shoebox, and wrapped in plain brown paper. I didn't open it. I couldn't. The next morning I called the police, but they didn't seem too concerned. "Has he threatened you?" the officer asked. "No," I admitted. "Well, unless he does something illegal, there's not much we can do," he said. "But we'll keep an eye out." I hung up feeling even more uneasy. I started keeping my curtains closed and my doors locked, but it didn't help. Every time I left the house, he was there, watching, waiting, always saying something that made me feel like he knew more about me than he should. Then, yesterday, I came home to find a note taped to my door. It was written in the same neat, blocky handwriting as the package. "I know your routine. Be careful." I haven't seen him since then, but I know he's still out there, watching. And I can't shake the feeling that he's waiting for something. It started on a Tuesday, during my usual commute home from work. I was stuck in traffic, like always, when I noticed the car behind me. It was an older sedan, maybe a late 90s model, with a faded blue paint job and a dent in the front bumper. At first, I didn't think much of it. Traffic was slow, and we were all just crawling along. But then I noticed how close it was. The driver was tailgating me, staying just a few feet behind my bumper. I could see them in my rearview mirror. A man, maybe in his 40s, with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He wasn't looking at the road. He was looking at me. I tapped my brakes, just enough to make the brake lights flash, but he didn't back off. If anything, he got closer. I changed lanes, hoping he'd stay in the other one, but he followed me. I sped up, and he sped up. I slowed down, and he slowed down. By the time I got off the highway, my hands were sweating on the steering wheel. I took a few random turns, trying to lose him, but he stayed right behind me. Finally, I pulled into a gas station and parked near the entrance. The sedan drove past, but I could see the driver's face in the side mirror as he went by. He was smiling. I sat in my car for a few minutes, my heart pounding, waiting to see if the sedan would come back. When it didn't, I finally got out and went inside the gas station to buy a bottle of water. My hands were still shaking as I handed the cashier a $5 bill. "You okay?" the cashier asked, giving me a concerned look. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a long day." I didn't tell her about the car. It sounded crazy, even to me. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the driver was just in a hurry. Or maybe he hadn't even realized how close he was following me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I got back in my car and checked my mirrors before pulling out of the gas station. The sedan was gone, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The rest of the drive home was uneventful, but I couldn't stop thinking about that blue car. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see it again, but the road behind me was empty. When I got home, I parked in my driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. The lights were off, just like I'd left them that morning. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. I got out of the car and was halfway to the front door when I heard it, the low rumble of an engine. I turned around, and there it was. The sedan. It was parked across the street, just far enough away that I couldn't see the driver's face, but close enough that I knew it was the same car. The engine was idling, and the headlights were off, but I could see the faint glow of the dashboard lights inside. I froze, my keys clutched tightly in my hand. The driver didn't move. He just sat there, watching me. After what felt like an eternity, I finally unlocked the door and went inside, locking it behind me. I peeked through the blinds, but the sedan was gone. I spent the rest of the evening trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe the sedan was just a coincidence. Maybe the driver lived in the neighborhood and had parked there for a completely innocent reason. But then I noticed something. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I saw it, a single muddy footprint on the floor near the back door. I hadn't been outside since I got home, and I definitely hadn't tracked mud inside. I knelt down to get a closer look. The print was large, too large to be mine, and it was fresh. The mud was still damp. My heart started racing again. I grabbed a knife from the drawer and checked the house, room by room, but there was no one there. The windows were all locked, and the doors were secure, except for the back door. The deadbolt was unlocked. I always lock it before I leave for work, but there it was, turned to the open position. I locked it again and leaned against the door, trying to calm my breathing. Maybe I'd forgotten to lock it that morning. Maybe the footprint was from earlier in the week, and I just hadn't noticed it until now. But I knew that wasn't true. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch with all the lights on, the knife on the coffee table in front of me. Every sound made me jump. The creak of the house settling, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of a car engine. The next morning, I left for work earlier than usual, hoping to avoid the sedan. But as I pulled out of the driveway, I saw it again. It was parked at the end of the street, the engine idling, the driver's face obscured by the glare of the morning sun on the windshield. I took a deep breath and drove past, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The sedan didn't follow me this time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I got to work, I tried to focus, but my mind kept wandering back to the muddy footprint and the unlocked door. I couldn't stop thinking about the driver, about the way he'd smiled at me in the gas station, about the way he'd just sat there, watching me. The workday dragged on, and by the time I got home, I was exhausted. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. The lights were off, just like I'd left them that morning. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. I got out of the car and was halfway to the front door when I noticed it. A faint, acrid smell, like burnt plastic or something electrical. It was coming from the house. I froze, my keys clutched tightly in my hand. The smell was subtle, but it was definitely there, and it wasn't something I'd ever noticed before. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the smell growing stronger as I moved through the hallway. It was coming from the kitchen. I flipped on the light and looked around, but everything seemed normal. The stove was off, the microwave was dark, and the toaster was unplugged. Then I saw it. On the counter, next to the sink, was a small, charred piece of paper. It was blackened around the edges, and the center was covered in ash, but I could still make out a few words written in neat, blocky letters. "I know where you sleep." My heart skipped a beat. I reached out to touch the paper, but it crumbled at the slightest pressure, leaving a fine layer of ash on the counter. I checked the house again, room by room, but there was no one there. The windows were all locked, and the doors were secure, except for the back door. The deadbolt was unlocked again. I locked the back door and checked it twice, just to be sure. Then I grabbed the knife from the kitchen drawer and sat down at the table, staring at the pile of ash on the counter. Who had been in my house, and how had they gotten in without me noticing? I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house felt like a footstep, every gust of wind against the windows like someone trying to get in. I kept the knife close, my eyes darting to the shadows in the corners of the room. The next morning, I left for work earlier again, hoping to avoid the sedan. But as I pulled out of the driveway, I saw it again. It was at the end of the street, just like the other day. This time, I didn't drive past. I stopped my car in the middle of the street, rolled down my window and shouted, "What do you want?" The sedan didn't move. The driver just sat there, staring at me. I honked my horn, but he didn't react. Finally, I drove off, my hands shaking on the wheel. That evening, after work, I decided to take a different route home. I drove through side streets and alleys, making sure no one was following me. When I finally pulled into my driveway and got out of the car, I noticed something on the windshield. It was a note tucked under the wiper blade. My heart skipped a beat as I pulled it free and unfolded it. The handwriting was the same neat, blocky letters as the charred paper in my kitchen. "You can't avoid me forever." I crumpled the note and threw it on the ground, my hands trembling. Then I noticed something else. The back door of my house was wide open. I stood there for a moment, staring at the open back door, my heart pounding in my chest. I took a deep breath and stepped into the house, got a knife, and held it out in front of me. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the open door behind me. I flipped on the light switch, but nothing happened. The power was out. I moved through the house slowly, checking every room, every corner, every shadow. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me, and the silence was deafening. Then I heard it, a faint creak from upstairs. The sound came again, louder this time, like someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. I climbed the stairs one at a time, the knife trembling in my hand. The hallway at the top was dark, but I could see a sliver of light coming from under the door to my bedroom. I pushed the door open slowly, and there he was. The driver. He was sitting on the edge of my bed, his baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't move when I came in, didn't even look up. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. He just sat there, staring at the floor. I took a step closer, the knife still held out in front of me. "Get out of my house!" Finally, he looked up. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were empty, like two black holes. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and raspy. "I'm not here to hurt you." "Then why are you here?" I demanded. He didn't answer. He just stood up and walked past me, so close I could smell the stale cigarette smoke on his clothes. I turned to follow him, but he was already gone. I searched the house again, but there was no sign of him. The back door was still open and the sedan was gone. I locked the door and sat down on the couch, my hands still shaking. The note was still crumpled on the floor, and I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. "I'm not here to hurt you." Then why was he here? I don't know. I still don't know. But something about his face, his expressions, made me feel like I already knew him, like he was not a complete stranger to me. I still think about that man, and why he was following me, though I never saw him, or the blue sedan, ever again. Turn on notifications so you're the first to know when I upload a new video. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.